Search and rescue authorities in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and in portions of East Texas and other pertinent areas have been alerted to the Space Shuttle contingency. Debris that is found that may be related to the Space Shuttle's contingency.
On February 1st, 2003, a streak of light across the Texas sky wasn't a falling star. It was the Space Shuttle Columbia breaking apart.
Pictures that we've been showing you of something sort of falling apart as it re-enters from space is in fact the Shuttle Columbia. We have heard NASA talking about their search and rescue efforts.
7 heroes were minutes from home, unaware that their fate had been sealed 16 days earlier by a piece of foam no heavier than a toaster. It was a tragedy defined by what-ifs. Could they have been saved? Did NASA know? We're diving into the haunting, preventable reality of one of history's greatest engineering heartbreaks. Ready to get your mind blown? The non-event that killed a spacecraft. We go back to the morning of January 16, 2003. It was a beautiful launch day at the Kennedy Space Center. The shuttle, designated STS-107, roared off the pad with 7 smiling astronauts and a cargo bay full of science experiments. To the naked eye, it was a textbook ascent. But deep within the high-speed film captured by tracking cameras, a ghost was hiding in the plumes of the solid rocket boosters. Exactly 81.7 seconds after liftoff, a chunk of insulating foam, roughly the size of a carry-on suitcase, broke off the external fuel tank. In the vacuum of a laboratory, a piece of spray-on foam seems harmless. It's light, porous, and about as dense as a styrofoam cooler. However, in the violent, high-velocity environment of a shuttle launch, the laws of physics transform the mundane into the lethal. The shuttle was traveling at nearly Mach 2.5, roughly 1,800 miles per hour, at the moment of the strike. When that piece of foam broke loose, it wasn't just drifting. It was caught in a chaotic aerodynamic slipstream. In less than a blink of an eye, the harmless foam collided with the leading edge of Columbia's left wing at a relative velocity of nearly 500 miles per hour. Think about that for a second. Imagine a 1.6-pound block of dense material hitting a stationary object at 500 miles per hour. It's no longer foam, it's a kinetic projectile. At that speed, the foam functioned less like insulation and more like a cannonball. The impact site was a critical area. The reinforced carbon-carbon RCC panels. These panels were the shuttle's armor, designed to withstand the 3,000-degree heat of re-entry. While they were incredibly strong against heat, they were notoriously brittle when it came to physical impacts. The following day, when NASA engineers reviewed the launch footage, they saw the strike. It wasn't a secret. In the graininess of the film, you can clearly see the foam shatter into a white cloud upon impact with the wing. Yet, the initial reaction from the Mission Management Team, MMT, was strangely muted. They had seen foam shedding before. It had happened on dozens of previous flights. Because no shuttle had ever been lost to a foam strike, a dangerous psychological trap began to close around the decision-makers, the belief that if it hadn't caused a disaster yet, it never would. The engineers on the ground, specifically the debris assessment team, were far more concerned than their bosses. They spent days trying to model the damage using a software program called Crater. The problem was that Crater was designed to predict the impact of much smaller ice particles, not massive chunks of foam. When the software suggested that the foam could have caused significant penetration of the RCC panels, management dismissed the results as overly conservative and unrealistic. They chose to believe the shuttle was fine because the alternative, that the wing was fatally compromised, was too terrifying to contemplate. This was the non-event that killed Columbia. It was a mechanical failure, yes, but more importantly, it was a failure of imagination. NASA had become so accustomed to the shuttle's flaws that they stopped seeing them as threats. They viewed the foam strike as a maintenance headache, something to fix after the shuttle landed, rather than a life-threatening emergency. They looked at a gaping hole in the most sensitive part of the spacecraft and convinced themselves it was a scratch. As Columbia orbited the Earth for 16 days, the crew performed their experiments, spoke to their families, and marveled at the view of the planet below. They were living in a spacecraft that was effectively a ticking time bomb. The left wing was no longer a solid shield. It was a breached vessel. On the other side of that thin, damaged RCC panel sat the aluminum skeleton of the wing, which had a melting point far lower than the temperatures it would soon face. The tragedy wasn't just that the foam hit the wing. It was that, for over 2 weeks, the most brilliant minds in aerospace had the opportunity to look for the hole, and they chose to keep their eyes closed. If the damage was so obvious on film, why did the mission continue as if nothing was wrong? The silent alarm. Normalization of deviance. In the high-stakes world of aerospace engineering, there is a psychological trap more dangerous than any hardware failure: the normalization of deviance. This term, coined by sociologist Diane Vaughan after the Challenger disaster, describes a process where people become so accustomed to a recurring anomaly that they stop seeing it as a risk. In the case of Columbia, the deviance was the shedding of foam from the external tank. It was never supposed to happen. NASA's own safety requirements strictly prohibited any debris from striking the shuttle during launch, yet it happened on almost every single flight. Because the shuttles kept coming home safely, the red flags were slowly painted green. Management began to view foam shedding as a maintenance nuisance rather than a safety of flight issue. They had succeeded their way into a state of terminal complacency. This cultural rot was on full display during the 16 days Columbia spent in orbit. While the astronauts were busy conducting experiments, a faction of engineers on the ground, the debris assessment team, was growing increasingly frantic. They had seen the launch footage, and unlike their superiors, they weren't willing to bet 7 lives on a hunch that the wing was fine. These engineers made 3 separate formal requests to obtain high-resolution satellite imagery from the Department of Defense. They wanted the U.S. spy satellite network to point its cameras at Columbia to see if there was a visible hole in the left wing. It was a logical, low-cost safety check. Shockingly, NASA management didn't just ignore these requests, they actively blocked them. Linda Ham, the chair of the mission management team, famously asked, "What are we going to do even if we find the damage?" This defeatist logic was a death sentence. By refusing to look at the wing, management wasn't protecting the crew. They were protecting their schedule and their ego. They didn't want to deal with the logistical nightmare of a damaged shuttle in orbit, so they simply decided the shuttle wasn't damaged. The engineers were told to stop agitating for imagery. In one of the most chilling displays of corporate coldness, a manager even told an engineer that he shouldn't be pursuing the issue because it would only create more work. The hierarchy at NASA at the time was incredibly rigid. Low-level engineers felt they couldn't speak up without risking their careers, and mid-level managers were more concerned with meeting the manifest, keeping the launch schedule, than with investigating what-ifs. This created a vacuum where critical information couldn't travel upward. The debris assessment team's concerns were softened and diluted as they passed through various committees. By the time the report reached the top, the terrifying possibility of a hole in the wing had been transformed into a PowerPoint slide that suggested minor tile damage was the worst-case scenario. It was a masterclass in how to lie to yourself using data. Even more heartbreaking was the crater software incident. As mentioned, the engineers used this tool to predict the damage, and the results were alarming. But because the software hadn't been validated for a piece of foam that large, Management used that lack of validation as an excuse to ignore the result entirely. They essentially argued that because they didn't have perfect data showing the wing was broken, they should assume the wing was perfect. It was a complete reversal of the safety-first mindset. In a healthy organization, the burden of proof is on showing that a vehicle is safe to fly. In the final days of Columbia, the burden of proof had shifted. The engineers had to prove the vehicle was unsafe, and management made it impossible for them to get the photos they needed to do so. The silence from the top was deafening. There were no emergency meetings to discuss rescue options, no frantic calls to the Department of Defense, and no honest conversations with the crew. The silent alarm was ringing at full volume in the cubicles of the engineers, but in the mahogany row offices of the mission management team, the sound had been muted by years of successful lucky landings. They had mistaken luck for reliability, and that mistake was about to cost them everything. The culture of NASA had become a closed loop, where the only information allowed in was the information that confirmed what they already wanted to believe, that Columbia was invincible. While management looked the other way, the crew of STS-107 was busy making history in the dark, 16 days of blissful ignorance. While the storm of bureaucracy and engineering anxiety swirled on the ground, the 7 souls aboard Columbia were living a completely different reality. For Commander Rick Husband, pilot William McCool, mission specialists Kalpana Chola, Laurel Clark, David Brown, Michael Anderson, and Israeli payload specialist Ilan Ramon, STS-107 was a triumph. Unlike many shuttle missions of the era that focused on International Space Station construction, this was a pure science mission. They were orbiting in a dedicated research module, working around the clock in 2 shifts, the red team and the blue team, to ensure that not a single moment of microgravity was wasted. They were conducting experiments on everything from fire suppression in space to the bone density of rats. To the crew, the mission was a flawless success. The atmosphere on board was one of profound camaraderie and awe. They filmed themselves laughing, chasing floating globules of orange juice, and staring out the windows at the thin blue line of Earth's atmosphere. There is a haunting video recovered from the wreckage, a tape recorded just minutes before the breakup, where the crew is seen putting on their gloves and joking about the orange glow visible through the windows during the early stages of re-entry. They were relaxed. They were happy. They were entirely unaware that their spacecraft was mortally wounded. This is perhaps the most gut-wrenching aspect of the Columbia story. The sheer contrast between the peaceful, productive life inside the cabin and the invisible, gaping hole in the left wing just a few feet away. On Flight Day 8, NASA management finally decided to mention the foam strike to Commander Husband and pilot McCool. However, the way they communicated it was a masterclass in downplaying a catastrophe. They sent a short email and a low-resolution video clip of the launch. The message essentially said, "We saw some foam hit the wing during liftoff, but our experts have looked at it, and there's no reason for concern. We've seen this before, and it's not a safety issue." They didn't tell the crew that engineers had begged for satellite photos. They didn't tell them that the crater software had predicted a total breach of the wing. They gave the astronauts just enough information to be aware of the event, but not enough to be worried about it. Because they were told there was no danger, the crew didn't push back. They trusted the blue suits and the PhDs at Mission Control. This trust was the bedrock of the astronaut corps, but in this instance it became a trap. There was no internal inspection of the wing because the shuttle didn't have a robotic arm on this specific mission, and a spacewalk, while technically possible, was considered too risky for a problem management had already decided didn't exist. So, the crew kept working. They studied how ants tunnels in space and how spiders spun webs in zero-G. One of the most famous experiments involved a canister of C. elegans roundworms, tiny organisms that were being used to study the effects of spaceflight on biological systems. The irony of the Columbia mission is that it was one of the most productive scientific flights in history. They completed over 80 experiments, many of which provided data that is still used by scientists today. Ilan Ramon, the first Israeli astronaut, carried a small Torah scroll that had survived the Holocaust, a symbol of resilience that he frequently spoke about during his broadcasts. The crew was focused on the future of humanity, on the expansion of knowledge, and on the beauty of a world without borders. They were the best of us, diverse, brilliant, and brave, operating under the assumption that the people on the ground were guarding their lives with the same intensity with which they were conducting their research. As the mission wound down, the crew prepared for de-orbit prep. They stowed their gear, strapped into their seats, and began the routine procedures for returning to Earth. They talked about seeing their families at the landing strip. They talked about the pizza they wanted to eat and the showers they wanted to take. There was no fear in the cockpit. There were no frantic prayers or last-minute goodbyes. There was only the professional rhythmic checklist of a crew coming home after a job well done. They had no way of knowing that, as they hit the upper reaches of the atmosphere, the very air that was supposed to guide them home would become a blowtorch, seeking out the weakness they had been told didn't exist. As the shuttle began its descent, the laws of physics were about to clash with the optimism of mission control. The final 16 minutes. The descent of a space shuttle is not a flight. It is a controlled fall. To return to Earth, Columbia had to shed 17,000 miles per hour of orbital velocity, converting that staggering kinetic energy into heat. As the shuttle hit the entry interface at 400,000 feet over the Pacific Ocean, the friction of the thinning air began to create a sheath of superheated plasma around the vehicle. Under normal circumstances, the reinforced carbon-carbon (RCC) panels would simply glow a dull orange, shielding the aluminum frame from the 3,000-degree inferno outside. But Columbia was not normal. The hole in panel 8 of the left wing was a gateway for disaster. At 8:44 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, as the shuttle crossed the California coast, the first signs of trouble appeared, not in the cockpit, but on the screens at Mission Control in Houston. A sensor in the left wing's hydraulic system began to show off-scale low readings, meaning it had simply stopped working. To the flight controllers, this initially looked like a localized sensor failure, a common glitch in aging spacecraft. However, within seconds, more sensors began to drop out. Temperature probes in the left wheel well were rising at an impossible rate. The superheated plasma was no longer flowing around the wing. It was jetting inside it like a blowtorch, melting the very structure that held the shuttle together. Inside the cabin, the crew remained eerily calm. The recovered cockpit video shows them looking out the windows at the fireworks of re-entry, unaware that the drag on the left wing was becoming immense. The shuttle's autopilot began to fight a losing battle, firing the steering jets and shifting the elevons to compensate for the massive aerodynamic drag pulling the ship to the left. The brain of Columbia knew it was dying before the crew did. At 8:58 a.m., the flight's mechanical officer, MEE, reported that tire pressure sensors on the left landing gear had lost. They had literally burned away. Commander Rick Husband finally acknowledged the glitch. "And, how?" he began, his voice calm and professional. He was interrupted by a brief burst of static. He tried again. "Roger, but..." And then, silence. At 8:59:32 a.m., the data stream from Columbia stopped. In that final second, The drag on the left wing had become so great that the shuttle's flight control system could no longer maintain its attitude. The wing likely folded upward or sheared off entirely, causing the orbiter to spin out of control at 18 times the speed of sound. At that velocity, the aerodynamic forces are not like wind. They are like a concrete wall. The shuttle didn't just break, it disintegrated. For several minutes, Mission Control refused to believe the silence. Flight Director Leroy Kane waited for a signal, his face a mask of controlled panic, as he asked the communications officer to try another string. On the ground in Texas and Louisiana, thousands of people looked up to see a single white streak turn into a chaotic starburst of multiple trails. It was the sound of the breakup that many remembered most. A low, rolling boom that rattled windows for hundreds of miles. Columbia was gone, scattered across 2 states in hundreds of thousands of pieces. The scene at Mission Control, when the lock the doors order was given, is one of the most somber moments in NASA history. It was the protocol for a catastrophic failure, preserving every scrap of data and every logbook for the investigation to come. The flight controllers sat in stunned silence, staring at empty monitors where a heartbeat of data should have been. The 7 families waiting at the Kennedy Space Center landing strip were quietly ushered away as the countdown to landing clock hit 0 and began to count upward into the negative, a digital ticking of a ghost ship that would never arrive. The tragedy was absolute, but the investigation that followed would reveal something even more haunting. As the debris was gathered from the forests and fields of East Texas, the engineering community began to run the numbers on a question that would haunt NASA for decades. If they had looked, and if they had known, could they have saved them? In the wake of the debris, a frantic search for answers revealed a chilling possibility. They didn't have to die. The Atlantis rescue, the great what-if. The most haunting question surrounding the Columbia disaster isn't, what happened? The physics of the foam strike answered that. The real question that keeps NASA veterans awake at night is, what if they had tried to save them? For years, the official line was that the crew was doomed the moment the foam hit the wing. But when the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, CAIB, released its final report, it included a chapter that read like a high-stakes Hollywood thriller. It concluded that a rescue mission was not just a fantasy. It was a technically feasible, albeit incredibly risky, reality. If NASA had acknowledged the hole in the wing by Flight Day 2, the gears of a massive rescue operation could have begun to turn. The plan centered on the Space Shuttle Atlantis. At the time of Columbia's launch, Atlantis was already on the processing floor at the Kennedy Space Center, being prepped for a mission scheduled for the following month. Under normal circumstances, it takes months to ready a shuttle for flight. But in a life-or-death scenario, NASA engineers estimated they could have processed Atlantis for an emergency launch in record time. It would have required 24-hour shifts, the skipping of non-essential testing, and a go-at-all-costs mentality. They would have needed to launch by February 10th to reach Columbia before the crew's oxygen and lithium hydroxide, which scrubs carbon dioxide, ran out. The logistics of an orbital rescue are mind-boggling. Atlantis would have launched with a skeleton crew of 4. Once it reached Columbia, the 2 shuttles would have performed a delicate orbital dance, flying belly to belly or nose to nose, as they couldn't dock with each other. Because Columbia didn't have a docking port for another shuttle, the rescue would have required a series of grueling back-to-back spacewalks. The 7 Columbia astronauts would have had to put on their pressurized suits, exit their airlock, and pull themselves along a tether across the terrifying void of space to the open cargo bay of Atlantis. It would have been the most daring feat in the history of human spaceflight. Even if a full rescue mission was deemed too slow, there was a Plan B that was arguably even more MacGyver-esque. Some engineers proposed an emergency repair. While the shuttle didn't carry a repair kit for the RCC panels, the crew could have potentially used scraps of heavy metal from the cabin, stuffed the hole with extra spacesuit water bags that would freeze into ice plugs, or used a combination of tools and spare parts to create a thermal heat shield. While these repairs likely wouldn't have survived a full-speed re-entry, they might have bought the wing enough time to hold together until the shuttle reached a lower, slower altitude where the crew could have bailed out via parachute. The tragedy of the what-if is that NASA never even had the conversation. The mission management team's refusal to even look for the damage meant they never triggered the rescue mode protocols. They chose the path of least resistance, which also happened to be the path of certain death. The CAIB report made it clear. The tools were there, the second shuttle was there, and the window of opportunity was open. NASA had the can-do spirit that had put men on the moon, but by 2003, that spirit had been smothered by a don't-tell-me-the-bad-news management style. There is a psychological weight to this realization. It means the 7 astronauts didn't die because of an unavoidable act of God. They died because of a failure of leadership. Had the managers listened to the engineers on day 3, the world might have witnessed the most incredible rescue in human history, a moment where the entire planet held its breath as 7 people floated from one spaceship to another. Instead, the world watched a debris trail over Texas. The what-if isn't just a technical curiosity. It's a moral indictment of how the mission was handled. It serves as a permanent reminder that in space, the most dangerous component isn't the rocket fuel or the vacuum, it's the human ego. Beyond the rescue that never was, the legacy of Columbia changed the way we reach for the stars forever. The aftermath and the ghost in the machine. The recovery of Columbia was a grim, monumental task. Over 25,000 searchers walked shoulder to shoulder across the brush of East Texas, eventually recovering 84,000 pieces of the orbiter, roughly 40% of the vehicle by weight. Among the twisted titanium and charred tiles, searchers found the crew's remains and their personal effects, a process that left deep emotional scars on the local volunteers. But amidst the wreckage, there was a discovery that felt like a glitch in the tragedy. A locker containing a science experiment was found relatively intact. Inside, the C. elegans roundworms, tiny microscopic creatures, were still alive. They had survived the breakup, the extreme heat of the plummet, and the terminal velocity impact with the ground. It was a haunting metaphor. Life is incredibly resilient, but the machines we build to protect it are fragile and prone to the errors of their creators. The disaster effectively marked the beginning of the end for the Space Shuttle program. The investigation didn't just point to a hole in a wing, it pointed to a hole in NASA's soul. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board, CAIB, was brutal in its assessment, stating that NASA had not learned the lessons of the Challenger disaster 17 years earlier. The board demanded that the shuttle be retired as soon as the International Space Station was finished. They argued that the vehicle was fundamentally a developmental craft, too complex and too dangerous for routine operations. The shuttle was no longer the futuristic space truck it had been marketed as in the 70s. It was a magnificent, flawed relic of an era that prioritized ambition over sustainable safety. However, from the ashes of Columbia, a new philosophy of spaceflight was born. The disaster forced NASA to look toward the private sector, eventually leading to the Commercial Crew Program. If you look at a SpaceX Dragon capsule today, you see the ghost of Columbia. Capsules are inherently safer than shuttles. They sit on top of the rocket, away from falling foam, and they feature launch escape systems that can pull the crew to safety if something goes wrong during ascent. Columbia taught the world that cool design, like a space plane with wings, is secondary to survivable design. Every time a modern astronaut splashes down safely in the ocean, they are benefiting from the hard-won data provided by the 7 who never came home. The ghost in the machine also lives on in the way we talk about organizational culture. The Columbia disaster is now a mandatory case study for business schools and engineering programs worldwide. It is the ultimate warning against groupthink and the normalization of deviance. It teaches leaders that the most important person in the room is often the one with the dissenting opinion, the engineer in the back row who is worried about a sensor reading that everyone else is ignoring. We've learned that silence in a meeting isn't the same as agreement. The legacy of the STS-107 crew isn't just the science they performed in orbit, it's the standard of intellectual honesty they left behind. Today, the remains of Columbia are housed in a secure room in the Vehicle Assembly Building at the Kennedy Space Center. It isn't a museum, it's a library of failure, accessible to engineers and astronauts who want to study the wreckage to ensure it never happens again. A small exhibit called Forever Remembered displays personal items from the crew: a flight jacket, a research log, a small wooden carving. It's a quiet, somber space that reminds us of the human cost of reaching for the stars. We didn't just lose a multi-billion-dollar machine that day, we lost 7 people who believed that the risk was worth the reward. As we look toward Mars and the Moon, the lesson of Columbia remains our North Star. The most dangerous part of any journey isn't the distance traveled, but the assumptions we make along the way. The tragedy was preventable, yes, but its legacy is a commitment to making sure that next time we don't just hope for the best, we plan for the worst. Listen to the quietest voices and never, ever stop looking at the wing. Your thoughts about this? Leave your comments below and subscribe to the channel for more. Thank you for supporting us.